Jack Thompson stood near the large bay windows of his restaurant, the Pinnacle, surveying the evening crowd with a sense of pride and ownership. Located in the heart of New York City's most affluent district, the Pinnacle wasn't just a place to eat. It was a symbol of exclusivity, of power, of Jack's hard-earned success. The restaurant was renowned for its French-inspired cuisine and its luxurious, understated decor. High-end clientele filled the tables. Politicians, movie stars, and hedge fund managers. All people who made the world turn in their favor. At 62, Jack was a man who carried the weight of his accomplishments on his shoulders. His silver hair was meticulously combed back. His tailored suit sat perfectly on his lean frame, and his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. He had worked relentlessly to build the Pinnacle into what it was. He prided himself on his ability to know his customers and to maintain a certain kind of atmosphere. Atmosphere that was as much about who was there as about the food they ate. As he looked around the dining room, Jack felt a surge of satisfaction. The gleaming chandeliers cast a warm glow on the tables, where couples dined in hushed tones, sipping wine from delicate crystal glasses. Everything was immaculate, and every detail was perfect, just as he wanted. But behind the scenes, Jack was a man of prejudice. While his outward demeanor was polished and professional, Jack privately held firm beliefs about who belonged in his restaurant and who didn't. He didn't openly speak of these views, but his staff knew. They could tell by the way he scrutinized guests as they walked through the door, how certain people were guided to the best tables while others were quietly seated near the back. Tonight, he saw a couple approaching the entrance, and his heart sank just slightly. He could feel his well-honed instincts kicking in. Sarah and David Williams walked confidently toward the glass-fronted entrance of the Pinnacle. They were celebrating their 15th wedding anniversary, a milestone they both cherished. David had made reservations weeks in advance, knowing how exclusive the restaurant was. He wanted this evening to be perfect for Sarah, a night to remember. They were a striking couple. David was tall, with dark skin and a clean-cut appearance that matched his black tailored suit. His calm demeanor and broad shoulders conveyed a quiet confidence. Beside him, Sarah was radiant in a deep emerald dress that highlighted her smooth complexion. Her dark curls framed her face, and her eyes sparkled with a mix of warmth and intelligence. Together, they were the picture of success, wealthy, accomplished, and well-respected in their fields. Sarah ran a successful nonprofit organization that focused on education in underserved communities, while David had made his fortune in real estate development and technology. As they neared the entrance, Sarah linked her arm through David's. She looked at him with a smile. "I can't believe we're finally here. This place has been on our list for so long." David smiled back. "Only the best for our anniversary. I wanted tonight to be special." The couple's optimism was palpable as they stepped into the restaurant, unaware of the tension brewing on the other side of the door. Jack watched from the shadows near the hostess stand as Sarah and David entered. He didn't need to hear them speak to know they were successful, but their success wasn't what bothered him. It was their race. Jack prided himself on keeping the Pinnacle exclusive, catering to the upper echelons of New York society. To him, success had a particular look, a particular feel, and while Sarah and David were dressed perfectly, they didn't fit the image he had so carefully cultivated. His smile faltered, barely noticeable to those around him, but his longtime staff knew that look. His maître d' Greg stood nearby and gave Jack a subtle nod. Greg had been with Jack for over a decade and knew what was expected without being told. The couple would be seated, but not at one of the coveted central tables. Jack approached Sarah and David with his well-practiced charm. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" David returned the smile, his tone friendly and polite. "Yes, we do. It's under Williams." Greg checked the reservation list, confirming it, and offered a brief nod to Jack. "Right this way," Jack said, gesturing towards the back of the restaurant, far from the prime seating areas. Sarah and David exchanged a glance as they were led toward a small table near the kitchen, but neither said a word. They were used to subtle slights like this. Instead of showing frustration, they sat down gracefully, determined not to let anything spoil their evening. "Thank you," Sarah said as Jack placed their menus on the table. Her voice was calm, but had an undertone of quiet strength. "You're welcome," Jack replied, though something in her tone unsettled him. He lingered a moment too long, his mind wrestling with why he felt this couple challenged the norms of his establishment. Throughout the evening, Jack kept an eye on Sarah and David from a distance. He watched as the other guests, mostly white and affluent, exchanged curious glances at the couple. The wait staff, sensing Jack's disapproval, avoided the couple's table more than necessary. Their orders were delayed, and the service they received was noticeably colder than that given to the other patrons. But Sarah and David didn't flinch. They carried on with their evening, laughing softly and enjoying each other's company. When their appetizers arrived, David commented on the delay, but in a light-hearted way that dismissed the tension rather than fueling it. Jack, however, couldn't let it go. He watched them with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. He had hoped they would feel uncomfortable enough to leave, yet they remained, their presence a quiet but powerful challenge to everything Jack believed about who belonged in the pinnacle. It wasn't just that they were black, it was that they were successful, elegant, and confident. In Jack's mind, their very existence disrupted the carefully curated image of his restaurant. The unease gnawed at him, and he found himself obsessing over how to reassert control. As the evening progressed, Jack Thompson's irritation continued to fester. He found himself glancing at Sarah and David Williams with increasing frequency, his disapproval deepening each time. The couple remained composed, unshaken by the delayed service and less than ideal table placement. Jack, however, could feel his grip on the evening slipping. The poised manner in which they conducted themselves, even in the face of subtle hostility, unnerved him. Back in the kitchen, Jack pulled Greg, his maitre d', aside. "Keep an eye on them," Jack muttered under his breath. "I want to make sure they don't cause any trouble." Greg, always aware of Jack's moods, nodded without question. "Of course, Mr. Thompson." Jack couldn't explain it, but something about Sarah and David's calm refusal to react to the slights bothered him deeply. He expected them to leave in frustration, or at least to complain, but they did neither. Instead, they laughed softly with each other, the unmistakable closeness of their relationship only adding to Jack's unease. At one point, Sarah leaned across the table and placed her hand over David's. The gesture was simple yet intimate, a small reflection of the love they shared. Jack turned away, feeling an irrational wave of anger. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Unable to tolerate their calm composure any longer, Jack decided to approach the couple. He made his way across the dining room, his steps measured, his practiced smile in place. As he neared their table, Sarah and David looked up, their expressions polite but watchful. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," Jack began, his voice smooth, "I hope you're enjoying your evening with us." David looked up, his face expressionless except for the faintest hint of a smile. "We are, thank you," he replied, his tone equally measured. Jack nodded, though inside he was wrestling with conflicting emotions. He wanted them to leave, yet he knew he couldn't make an overt move without risking a scene. Instead, he tried to mask his irritation with professionalism. "I wanted to personally ensure that everything is to your satisfaction. You see, we take great pride in the exclusivity and quality of our service here." There was a slight emphasis on the word exclusivity, and though subtle, the implication wasn't lost on Sarah or David. Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly, her eyes meeting Jack's with quiet confidence. "Everything has been fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We appreciate your concern." Jack's smile tightened. "Good, good," he said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were deliberately challenging him. "We aim to provide the best dining experience for all of our guests." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze still steady. "We're enjoying our anniversary here, and we're glad we chose the pinnacle." For a split second, Jack hesitated. Anniversary? He hadn't known this was a special occasion for them. For a moment he considered softening, but his pride wouldn't allow it. His ego had already been bruised by their unwavering composure, and now knowing they had chosen the pinnacle for such an important event, he felt an even greater need to reassert control. "Well, I'm glad to hear that," Jack said, his voice a bit stiffer now. "But I must say, I'm somewhat surprised that you chose the pinnacle for your anniversary. It's not the sort of place one typically sees your type of clientele." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jack could feel his heart race slightly as he waited for their reaction. confident that he had finally delivered the message he had been holding back all night. There was a brief moment of silence at the table. Sarah and David exchanged a glance. Nothing more than a flicker of understanding between them. But it spoke volumes. They had dealt with situations like this before, but tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, they had wanted to simply enjoy each other's company without the undercurrent of racial tension. David's expression didn't change, but his voice grew slightly firmer. "Our type of clientele?" he repeated softly, his gaze not leaving Jack's. Jack felt a flicker of unease. He had expected anger, maybe even outrage, but the calm in David's voice threw him off. He had hoped for a reaction that would justify his discomfort, something that would give him the upper hand. But David remained poised. Jack forced a smile, though his heart was racing now. "We cater to a very specific demographic here at the Pinnacle," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere, a certain level of exclusivity." David leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Jack's. "We made our reservation through the same process as anyone else," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And we've been nothing but respectful. So I'm not quite sure what you're implying, Mr. Thompson." Jack could feel the tension rising, but he was too far gone now to back down. "I just want to make sure everything is in order," he said, his voice tightening. "You understand, of course, that we have high standards here." "We do," Sarah interjected, her voice cool but unwavering. "And that's why we chose the Pinnacle. We were looking forward to enjoying our evening here." The comment landed with precision, and for a brief moment, Jack felt as if he had lost control of the situation. He had underestimated them, and now he found himself standing in front of two people who refused to bow to the subtle racism he had cloaked in politeness. For a brief moment, Jack considered backing down, letting the conversation drop. But his pride wouldn't allow it. The unease that had been building all evening boiled over, and before he could stop himself, he spoke the words that would change everything. "I don't believe this is the right place for you," Jack said, his tone now more direct. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah and David both stood, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no anger in their faces, no visible sign of frustration or hurt, only quiet, composed dignity. David looked Jack in the eye, his voice steady and calm. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson. We won't trouble you any further. But people will always show you who they really are, one way or another." Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes locked onto Jack's. "Have a good evening," she said, her voice polite but firm. With that, they gathered their belongings and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Jack standing there, his hands clenched at his sides. He watched as they exited the building, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and regret wash over him. He had gotten what he wanted. They were gone. But the way they had left, without a hint of anger or protest, made him feel more unsettled than ever. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Jack returned to his usual post near the entrance, but his mind was elsewhere. The other patrons carried on with their meals, pretending not to notice what had just transpired, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Jack tried to shake it off, telling himself that he had done what was necessary to maintain the integrity of his restaurant. But the unease gnawed at him. Deep down, Jack knew that something had shifted. The cold confidence with which David had delivered his parting words left a mark on him that he couldn't quite identify. Over the next few days, Jack tried to forget the encounter, burying himself in the daily operations of the Pinnacle. But the consequences of his actions soon became clear. Word of what had happened that night began to spread, first in small circles, then across social media. A few negative reviews appeared online, detailing the subtle racism Sarah and David had experienced. Jack dismissed them at first, thinking they wouldn't matter. After all, the Pinnacle had an impeccable reputation. But the story didn't die, it grew. Soon, regular patrons began to quietly distance themselves from the restaurant, and Jack noticed a shift in the atmosphere. People whispered about the incident, and some of the more progressive members of the city's elite canceled their reservations, unwilling to be associated with the growing scandal. Just as Jack was beginning to wonder how far this backlash might go, he received a letter that piqued his interest. It was from a prestigious law firm representing an anonymous client who was interested in acquiring the Pinnacle and the other restaurants in Jack's small but profitable chain. The letter was professional and to the point. The offer was generous, well above market value. Jack's curiosity was piqued. The thought of selling had crossed his mind before, but now with the growing tensions around the restaurant's reputation, this offer seemed like a perfect way out. He arranged a meeting with the law firm, eager to hear more. As he sat in the law firm's sleek conference room, Jack felt a twinge of anticipation. If the offer was as lucrative as it seemed, he could sell the Pinnacle, walk away with millions, and retire comfortably. It would be the perfect solution. But when the door opened and the prospective buyers entered, Jack's heart stopped cold. It was Sarah and David Williams. Jack Thompson's breath caught in his throat as Sarah and David Williams entered the conference room. His mind raced, struggling to process the sight of them standing there, impeccably dressed in tailored business attire, exuding an air of quiet authority. This was the last thing he had expected. He had assumed his prospective buyers would be other restaurant moguls or wealthy investors from his world. But now the couple he had insulted and dismissed from his restaurant just days ago were standing before him. For a moment, Jack felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. All he could do was stare in disbelief as Sarah and David took their seats across from him, calm and composed, as if they had been expecting this meeting all along. David was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice smooth and professional, "thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Jack blinked, his usual composure slipping. "Mr. Williams, Mrs. Williams, I was expecting—" His voice trailed off as Sarah smiled politely. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Thompson," she said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "We have a lot to discuss." Still reeling from the shock, Jack sat down slowly, his mind struggling to catch up. As he settled into his chair, a team of lawyers and financial advisors entered the room, carrying briefcases and stacks of documents. They took their places on either side of Sarah and David, further solidifying the couple's position of power in the room. Jack felt a cold sweat begin to form on the back of his neck. For a few moments there was silence as the legal team organized their papers. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm, though the unease gnawed at him. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about control, about who held the upper hand. David leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "I'm sure you're wondering why we're here today," he began, his voice measured and deliberate. "Allow me to explain. My wife and I are entrepreneurs. We've built a portfolio in the hospitality industry, including several high-end restaurants. When we came to the Pinnacle the other night, it wasn't just to celebrate our anniversary. We were also evaluating it as a potential acquisition." Jack's stomach dropped. He felt as though he had been sucker punched, but he struggled to maintain his composure. You were evaluating the Pinnacle?" he echoed, his voice tight. David nodded, his expression calm. "That's right. We've been interested in expanding our portfolio, and the Pinnacle seemed like the perfect fit. Before the events of that evening, of course, Jack felt the blood drain from his face. He had thought he was dealing with just another couple who didn't belong, who didn't fit his narrow definition of what his clientele should look like. But now he realized with growing horror that they weren't just patrons. They were the kind of powerful business people he had always respected, the people he thought he belonged with, and now they had the power to take everything from him. Sarah spoke next, her voice calm and firm. "We're prepared to make you an offer for the Pinnacle and the rest of your restaurant chain," she said, sliding a document across the table toward Jack. "It's a generous offer, well above market value. We believe it will benefit all parties involved." Jack stared at the document, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. He glanced at the number on the page, and his heart skipped a beat. It was more than he had expected, far more than the restaurant was worth in its current state. The financial incentive was undeniable. But as his eyes skimmed over the terms, he realized there was more to this deal than just money. David continued, his voice growing more serious. "There are a few conditions, however, that we'll need you to agree to." Jack's stomach tightened. "Conditions?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah said, her tone professional, but with a slight edge. "First, the sale must be completed immediately. We don't want this process to drag out for months. We have the resources to finalize everything quickly, and we expect the same from you." Jack nodded slowly. Immediate sale. He could handle that. He needed the money, and the faster the deal was done, the better. But there was something in Sarah's tone that told him the worst was yet to come. David leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. The second condition, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, is that you leave the restaurant business entirely. No involvement, no public statements, no interviews. Once the sale is complete, you walk away quietly and don't look back. Jack's eyes widened. You want me to leave? He asked, his voice incredulous. Completely? Sarah nodded. That's right. We want a clean break. You'll take the money and move on. Jack felt his throat tighten. He had spent years building the pinnacle, pouring his heart and soul into making it what it was. The idea of walking away, without any recognition, without any acknowledgement of his role in its success, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. But David wasn't done. There's one more condition, he said, his gaze locking onto Jack's. You will agree never to open a similar establishment again. If you do, we will consider it a breach of contract and pursue legal action. At this, Jack's composure cracked. He felt his chest tighten with anger, his pride screaming for him to fight back. This wasn't just a business transaction. They were stripping him of everything that had defined him for so long. His identity, his legacy, his very sense of self was being torn away from him. Why? Jack asked, his voice shaking. Why are you doing this? Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was a steely resolve in her eyes. Because of how you treated us that night, she said, her voice cold. You made it clear that people like us don't belong in your world. And now, we're taking control of that world. Jack sat in stunned silence, the weight of their words pressing down on him like a crushing burden. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. His mind raced as he tried to process the situation. How had it come to this? How had he let his pride and prejudice lead him to this moment, where the very people he had tried to belittle were now offering him a fortune, on the condition that he walked away in silence? He wanted to fight, to argue, to defend himself. But he knew that there was no argument to be made. Sarah and David held all the cards now, and they knew it. His reputation was already starting to crumble, and if he refused the deal, it would only get worse. The public backlash would grow, his investors would pull out, and the pinnacle would be lost to him anyway. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked down at the document again, the numbers swimming before his eyes. He could feel his pride resisting, screaming at him to refuse, to stand his ground, to keep what was his. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't take the deal, he would lose everything: his restaurant, his reputation, his future. Finally, with great reluctance, Jack nodded. Fine, he said, his voice barely audible. I'll agree to your terms. A small, satisfied smile played on David's lips. Excellent, he said, his tone cool and controlled. Our lawyers will finalize the paperwork, and we can move forward with the sale. Sarah nodded in agreement, her expression softening slightly. You're making the right decision, Mr. Thompson, she said. This will be good for everyone involved. But Jack didn't respond. He couldn't. His pride was too wounded, his sense of self too shattered to say anything. All he could do was sit in silence as the lawyers went over the details, outlining the steps that would lead to his exit from the restaurant world he had built his life around. The meeting continued, the legal team discussing the finer points of the contract. Jack sat in a daze, his mind numb as the reality of the situation sank in. He was selling the pinnacle, but it felt like he was selling a part of himself. His pride, his identity, his legacy. When the meeting finally ended, Jack stood up, his movements mechanical. David extended his hand, a gesture that felt both polite and triumphant. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Thompson, he said, his grip firm. We'll ensure the transition is smooth. Jack shook his hand, but his heart wasn't in it. I'm sure you will, he muttered, his voice devoid of emotion. As Sarah and David left the room, followed by their legal team, Jack remained behind for a few moments, staring at the table in front of him. The room felt cold, empty, and Jack realized that this wasn't just the end of his restaurant, it was the end of the life he had known. He had made the only choice he could, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like defeat, like surrendering to forces beyond his control. And in a way, it was. Jack had spent his entire life believing that he was better than others, that his wealth and success made him untouchable. But now he understood the truth. His own pride had led him to this moment, and there was no turning back. Sarah and David Williams walked into the Pinnacle the morning after the sale was finalized. The restaurant was now officially theirs, and the sense of accomplishment that washed over them was profound. The past few days had been an emotional whirlwind, but they had done it. They had taken control of the establishment that had once symbolized exclusivity and exclusion. Now, under their leadership, it would represent something entirely different: inclusivity, warmth, and success that transcended race and class. The staff greeted them with a mix of curiosity and respect, unsure of what changes the new owners would bring. Sarah smiled as she approached the head chef, the maitre d', and the waitstaff. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice warm and welcoming. "We're excited to work with all of you to make the Pinnacle an even better place." David stepped forward, his tone professional but friendly. "We're not here to make drastic changes overnight, but we do want to make some adjustments. We believe that the Pinnacle can remain a luxurious dining destination while also becoming a more welcoming place for everyone." The staff, still cautious but intrigued, nodded. Sarah and David's reputation preceded them. They were known for their success, but also for their fairness and commitment to community building. The employees were hopeful, sensing that the new ownership might actually bring positive change. Sarah and David began by walking through the restaurant, pointing out small but significant changes they planned to make. The decor would remain elegant, but they wanted to incorporate more diverse cultural elements, subtle touches that would make everyone feel more welcome. The menu, too, would undergo a transformation, with new dishes inspired by global flavors that reflected the diversity of New York City's population. In the coming weeks, the Pinnacle would be rebranded, not drastically, but thoughtfully. The restaurant's reputation for exclusivity would shift, and its new image would be one of openness, a place where anyone, regardless of background, could feel comfortable and appreciated. While Sarah and David were busy transforming the Pinnacle, Jack Thompson sat alone in his small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The sale had gone through, and his bank account was now flush with the proceeds from the deal. But the money brought him little comfort. The bitterness of defeat clung to him like a shadow, and the realization of what he had lost gnawed at him day after day. He hadn't set foot in the Pinnacle since the sale, and he couldn't bring himself to look at the headlines that were now praising the restaurant under its new ownership. Jack knew that people in the community were talking about him, how the once proud owner had sold his empire to the very couple he had tried to humiliate. He was now a cautionary tale, a symbol of the downfall that came from pride and prejudice. His former friends and business associates had distanced themselves from him. The social circles he had once been a part of were now closed to him, and invitations to high-profile events dried up. The elite patrons who had once frequented his restaurant no longer had any reason to seek his company. Jack was left with nothing but his memories and his regrets. In the quiet of his apartment, Jack replayed the events of that night over and over in his mind. He remembered the way he had looked down on Sarah and David, the way he had assumed they didn't belong in his world. And now they owned the very thing that had once been his pride and joy. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Jack couldn't escape the truth. His own actions had led him here. His pride had blinded him, and now he was paying the price. Alone with nothing but his wealth to keep him company, Jack felt more isolated than ever. Under Sarah and David's leadership, the Pinnacle began to thrive in ways it never had before. The changes they implemented were subtle but powerful, and the response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. The restaurant's clientele became more diverse, attracting not only the city's elite, but also people from different backgrounds who had previously felt unwelcome. The menu, now featuring dishes from various cultures, drew rave reviews from food critics, who praised the creativity and inclusivity that the new owners had brought to the table. Business boomed, and reservations were booked weeks in advance. The restaurant became a destination for celebrations, business meetings, and special occasions, and its reputation as one of the city's finest dining establishments remained intact. For Sarah and David, the success of the Pinnacle was more than just a financial victory. It was a personal triumph. They had taken a place that had once symbolized exclusion and turned it into a beacon of inclusivity and respect. They had proven that true elegance and luxury didn't come from keeping people out. It came from welcoming people in. The transformation of the Pinnacle became a symbol of change in the city. It represented the shift toward a more inclusive, progressive society where success wasn't defined by race or class, but by character and vision. Months passed, and Jack Thompson found himself haunted by the success of the Pinnacle under its new ownership. He read the glowing reviews, saw the headlines praising the changes Sarah and David had made, and realized with growing dread that his worst fear had come true. The restaurant was thriving without him. In fact, it was doing better than it ever had while he was in charge. Jack's isolation deepened. He rarely left his apartment, choosing instead to dwell on his past decisions and the consequences that had followed. He no longer had the influence or status he once enjoyed, and the world seemed to have moved on without him. One evening, Jack found himself standing outside the Pinnacle. He had come there on a whim, drawn by some faint hope of reconnecting with the place he had once called his own. But as he stood outside, looking through the glass windows at the bustling dining room, he realized that the Pinnacle was no longer his. It had become something different, something better. Jack approached the hostess stand, hoping to make a reservation. The hostess, polite and professional, didn't recognize him. When he gave his name, she offered a courteous but firm response. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but we're fully booked tonight. Perhaps you could try another date?" Jack thanked her and turned away, his heart heavy. He had once ruled this place, but now he was just another face in the crowd. The realization hit him hard. The restaurant had moved on, and so had the world. He was no longer a part of it. As Jack walked away from the Pinnacle, the weight of his regrets pressed down on him. He had spent so many years believing that he was better than others, that his success made him untouchable. But now he understood the truth. His pride and prejudice had cost him everything. In the end, it wasn't Sarah and David who had taken the Pinnacle from him. It was his own actions, his own choices, that had led to his downfall. He had built his life around exclusion and superiority, and now he was paying the price for it. As he walked through the streets of the city, Jack realized that redemption wasn't something he could buy with money or status. It was something he would have to find within himself. And for the first time in his life, he understood that he had a long way to go before he could even begin to make amends. The Pinnacle continued to thrive under Sarah and David's leadership, becoming a symbol of change and progress in the community. The restaurant's success was a testament to their vision and hard work, and it stood as a reminder that true greatness came not from keeping people out, but from welcoming people in. For Jack, the road to redemption was long and difficult. He spent the rest of his life reflecting on the choices he had made, slowly coming to terms with the fact that his legacy was not one of success, but of pride and prejudice. He never fully regained the respect or influence he had once enjoyed, but he found some peace in the knowledge that the world had moved on, and that in the end, it was a better place without the values he had once held dear. The transformation of the Pinnacle was complete, and Jack Thompson was left behind, a relic of a time that had passed him by. The restaurant, now a thriving symbol of inclusivity, stood as a reminder of the power of change and the importance of letting go of old prejudices. 5 years had passed since the Pinnacle underwent its transformation under the leadership of Sarah and David Williams. The restaurant was now more than a high-end dining establishment. It had become a symbol of change and progress in New York City. The cultural shifts the couple had implemented were subtle but profound, and the impact they had on the local community was undeniable. The Pinnacle was thriving in ways Jack Thompson never could have imagined. The blend of elegance, luxury, and inclusivity attracted an even more diverse clientele, from business moguls to young professionals, from established families to rising artists. Sarah and David had expanded their restaurant portfolio, acquiring 2 more prestigious locations, each designed to reflect their vision of success through inclusivity. Meanwhile, Jack Thompson had disappeared from the public eye. After the sale, he withdrew into a life of solitude. His wealth remained, but the respect and admiration he once enjoyed were gone. The social circles that had once welcomed him no longer extended invitations, and Jack had grown accustomed to the quiet, reflective life he now led in his modest apartment on the city's outskirts. One afternoon, Jack sat in a small cafe, sipping his coffee and reading the headlines on his tablet. He came across an article about Sarah and David, detailing their continued success in the restaurant industry and their philanthropic efforts in the city. They had established a foundation that supported young entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds, giving them opportunities Jack had once taken for granted. As Jack scrolled through the article, he felt a familiar pang of regret. For years he had reflected on his mistakes, but he had done little to make amends. His pride had kept him from reaching out, from trying to correct the course he had set so many years ago. But now, as he read about the people Sarah and David had helped, something shifted in him. Later that week, Jack made his way to a small community center where one of Sarah and David's programs was being held. The center was bustling with energy. Young entrepreneurs gathered to discuss ideas, share resources, and learn from mentors who had once been in their shoes. Jack entered the room quietly, feeling out of place. He had spent decades at the top, looking down on those who didn't fit into his narrow definition of success. Now he was the outsider, trying to find a way back into a world that had moved on without him. After sitting in on a few discussions, Jack approached one of the program's coordinators. "I'd like to help," he said, his voice hesitant but genuine. "I used to run a few restaurants in the city and, well, I have experience. I'd like to mentor if that's possible." The coordinator looked at him curiously. "Are you Jack Thompson?" she asked, recognizing his name from the old days. Jack nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The coordinator paused for a moment, then smiled. "We can always use more mentors. People with your experience could be a great resource for these young entrepreneurs." For the first time in years, Jack felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was his chance to do something meaningful, to use his experience for good, to help others in ways he had once refused to see. Sarah and David's success continued to soar. Beyond their restaurant empire, they had become role models for other entrepreneurs looking to make a mark in the industry. They frequently spoke at conferences and events, sharing their journey and the challenges they had overcome. Their message was clear. Success was about more than profit. It was about community, inclusivity, and treating people with respect. Their foundation, which supported underrepresented entrepreneurs, had grown significantly, and they were frequently approached by media outlets wanting to tell their story. They used their platform not just to promote their business, but to advocate for social change, encouraging other businesses to adopt similar values. In the years since taking over the pinnacle, Sarah and David had become a powerful force in the business world, but they never lost sight of the values that had brought them here. They remained humble, generous with their time and resources, and committed to creating opportunities for others. Their restaurant empire expanded, but each new location was a reflection of their original vision, a place where people from all walks of life could come together, enjoy great food, and feel valued. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the experience, the atmosphere, and the feeling of belonging. For Jack, the hardest part of his new life wasn't the isolation or the loss of status. It was the realization that his legacy, once so important to him, had been built on a foundation of exclusion and superiority. Over the years, he had come to understand that his pride had blinded him to what truly mattered. He had spent decades believing that success was about control, about maintaining a certain image, about keeping people out. But as he watched Sarah and David thrive, he realized that the true legacy of the pinnacle was not its exclusivity, but the change it had undergone. The restaurant was no longer a symbol of power for the elite. It was a place of connection, of inclusion, of shared success. Jack's reflections often brought him back to that night when he had confronted Sarah and David in his restaurant. He remembered their quiet dignity, the way they had refused to be rattled by his thinly veiled insults. At the time, he had seen it as a challenge to his authority. Now he understood that they had shown him something far more important, that strength didn't come from belittling others, but from lifting them up. He couldn't undo the choices he had made, but he could try to create something better in their place. His work at the community center became a source of fulfillment, a way for him to contribute to a future where success wasn't defined by exclusion, but by collaboration and mutual respect. The Pinnacle's transformation had a ripple effect on the community. Other businesses in the area began to follow suit, adopting more inclusive practices and welcoming a more diverse clientele. The restaurant became a symbol of what could be achieved when people were willing to embrace change, and its success inspired others to do the same. The local press frequently covered the positive impact the Pinnacle was having, both in terms of business and social progress. It became a favorite spot not just for fine dining, but for community events, fundraisers, and cultural celebrations. People who had once felt unwelcome now saw the Pinnacle as a place where they could celebrate milestones, gather with friends, and feel part of something bigger. As the restaurant's reputation grew, it began to attract visitors from other cities, eager to experience the atmosphere that had made it so successful. And with each passing year, the Pinnacle became a shining example of how inclusivity and success were not mutually exclusive. In fact, they were deeply connected. For the city, the Pinnacle was more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of progress, a place where old divisions were left behind and new possibilities were embraced. One evening, Jack sat at his desk, looking at an old photograph of himself standing outside the Pinnacle on the day it first opened. He was younger then, full of ambition and pride, eager to make a name for himself. He had built something remarkable, but he had built it on the wrong values. As he stared at the photo, Jack realized that his legacy wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about the choices he had made along the way. For years, he had believed that his success was a reflection of his superiority. But now he understood that true success was about connection, about lifting others up, about creating something that could last beyond one person's ego. The restaurant was no longer his, but that didn't mean his life had to be without meaning. Jack had started mentoring young entrepreneurs at the community center, using his experience to guide them, to help them avoid the mistakes he had made. He found satisfaction in watching them grow, succeed, and learn how to build businesses that reflected values of inclusion and respect. In the end, Jack knew he could never fully undo the damage he had caused, but he could still create something positive from it. His legacy would no longer be about the restaurant, but about the lessons he had learned and the people he had helped along the way. And perhaps in the quiet of his new life, that would be enough. If you found Jack's journey of pride, downfall, and reflection compelling, make sure to subscribe to Turning Tables, where we bring you stories that challenge perspectives and highlight the power of change. What would you have done in Jack's situation? How can moments like these shape the future? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more transformative stories. Together, we can explore the complexities of human nature and the power of redemption.